All right, everybody, can we take our seats, get started? I'd like to welcome all of you to CSIS. I'm Jeff Mankoff with the Russia and Eurasia program here, and it's my great pleasure and privilege to welcome Professor Tim Snyder for a conversation today about Russia's war, Ukraine's history, and the West's options. Tim is the Bird White Hosum Professor of History at Yale, and he's one of the leading international scholars and experts on Central and Eastern Europe. He's the author of multiple books, speaker of multiple languages, and has been a very active public intellectual since the Ukraine crisis has started. If you haven't seen the YouTube clips of the Ukraine Thinking Together initiative that Tim was involved in, I would very much encourage you to go take a look at those. As I said, Tim is a professor of history at Yale, and I think that's very apropos to have him here today discussing the conflict in Ukraine, because as much as anything, this is a conflict about history and about historical narratives, how the past is interpreted to shape the present. What is Ukraine? How does Ukraine fit into the jigsaw puzzle of European civilization, and what is its relationship to Russia? These are all questions that can't be answered just looking at events of the last 12 months, but indeed, these are questions that have a historical resonance going back centuries. And if you think about some of the key issues in the conflict and the crisis in Ukraine that has been going on for the past year or so, a lot of the debate centers around historical questions, like what is the legacy of the Second World War? What is the legacy of people like Stepan Bandera? And indeed, it's not only a question of Ukrainian history, but it's also a question of Russian history. Because if anything, this crisis has forced us to think about what kind of Russia we want and what kind of Russia we have. What are the historical roots of the Russia that we're dealing with today? And I can't think really of anybody who's better placed to answer those kind of questions than Tim. So I think what we're going to do is we'll have Tim talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a conversation, and I'll open it up for Q&A with the audience. So with that, please join me in welcoming Tim Snyder. Thanks, Jeff.
I'm wired. Okay. So thank you very much, Jeff. What I'd like to be able to do today is speak both to the specific moment. We are at a specific moment, the day after parliamentary elections in Ukraine, and to speak to a general situation, a historical turning point at which I believe we find ourselves. I hope we can describe this moment, but I also hope we can conceptualize a little bit, because without concepts, without general ideas, you sometimes can't see how serious the situation you are in is, or in this case, how deep the hole we all are in is. If we speak about Russia, Ukraine, the West, we're speaking about a challenge that comes from Russia, which has to do above all with Ukrainian history. Most obviously, this is about the past and the future of Ukraine. But what I want to stress as we move through the argument is that, to extend Jeff's introductory point, this is very much about the history of the West. This challenge is a challenge to us in the West to recognize that the things that we take for granted, European integration and the transatlantic relationship, themselves have a history, and all things that have a history can come to an end, and that this might well be the moment when these things come to an end. So the short answer to the question posed by the title, the West's options, are there are two: to be and not to be. And fundamentally, that is what this is all about. Now let me take about 40 minutes and try to make that case. The first thing I want to stress is that in considering and in facing up to the challenge from Russia, the challenge of Russia's foreign policy, the challenge of Russia's new anti-European orientation, we have to exert a certain amount of effort, and we have to take things seriously. It's very important not to dismiss individual Russian statements because they might seem nonsensical. It's very important to avoid grand historical claims like, for example, we live in the 21st century, therefore this kind of thing is impossible, or that we're a world power and they're only a regional power. All of these are ways of dismissing something which is in fact a very serious challenge. So what I would like to do is to try to take the Russian challenge as seriously as possible, to be respectful of the people who are formulating it because they are serious and they are intelligent and they understand a number of our weaknesses. Their problem, by the way, may be that they understand our weaknesses better than they understand their own weaknesses, but we'll see about that. The way I'd like to proceed is by way of a three-step argument, 3 steps which I hope will summarize what has happened in the last 9 months or so and where we are now. I'm going to roll through the reorientation of Russian policy at the level of tactics, at the level of strategy, and finally, I think most importantly, at the level of philosophy. But before I do that, let me give you just the quickest of reminders of what's happened in the last 9 months. And before I do that, I should say that how I see all this might be a little bit different than how you do. I haven't been inside the Beltway for 2 years, which I have to say is incredibly refreshing, and you should all try it. Most of that time, I've been in Europe, a good deal of it, I've been in Ukraine. So I've been more touched by Russian propaganda, with which I've spent thousands of hours, and events in Ukraine, with which I've also spent thousands of hours, than I have been by debates here. But this summary might reflect that. So the chronology, as I see it, begins in the summer and autumn of last year, when Russian foreign policy at the level of declaration, at the level of doctrine, and then at the level of practice took a decisive turn against the European Union, defining the European Union rather than the United States for the first time as a central adversary, providing a clear institutional alternative to the European Union known as the Eurasian Union, and ramping up with a set of propaganda objectives designed to present the European project not as one of integration moving forward steadily towards more peace and prosperity, but as one of decadence. Where decadence is a very strong word. Often when we think of decadence, we just imagine, a 19th century painting of a fat Roman emperor with grapes. But what decadence means is that something is self-destructing. It means something is coming to an end, which is a very different portrayal of the European Union than perhaps the one that we were accustomed to. Unless you are some of my neoconservative friends, in which case it's very familiar, and you're partly to blame. Okay. All right. So the way the chronology begins is with this turn towards the European Union at the level of doctrine and at the level of propaganda. The test was with the association agreement, which was to be signed in November of last year. As you will all remember, President Yanukovych, then the president of Ukraine, had spent most of 2013 preparing his population for the association agreement to be signed. Then at the very last moment, he changed his mind, or his mind was changed for him after discussion with President Putin. And in fact, Ukraine did not sign the association agreement. In my opinion, what most likely happened, although we may never know for sure, is that Putin threatened Yanukovych with the loss of Crimea. But we can't be sure of that. What followed then was a surprise to everyone. And it's important that it was a surprise. What followed then were mass protests in Ukraine. The day after the failure to sign the association agreement, young people gathered in Independence Square in Kiev, better known as the Maidan. Not long after that, they were beaten by Ukrainian security forces, which led to a much larger gathering along the lines of generally parents, sometimes Afghan veterans, actually very often Afghan veterans, wanting to protect the young people who they often refer to as their children. In a kind of generic, generational sense, the young people, the future of the country, are children. The protests continued throughout December, morphing from a strict defense of the association agreement towards a more general defense of the idea of Europe, which in Ukraine means the rule of law. In December, the Russians offered a deal to the Ukrainian government, which was, we will pay you a certain amount of money in the billions if you will put down these protests. The protests did not stop. That deal was repeated by Prime Minister Medvedev in January and February. This led to the dictatorship laws of February 2014, which basically ended any pretense that Ukraine was a liberal democratic state. It also led to the mass shootings of February 2014, which in turn led to a change of government and a revolution. What followed from there was the Russian invasion of Crimea, clearly a set piece which had been prepared for some other scenario since it was clearly already ready. Refugee crises, intervention in the southeast, ethnic violence. Then, on the Ukrainian side, free and fair democratic presidential elections in May, free and fair parliamentary elections yesterday. Meanwhile, despite various ceasefires, including the one which is supposedly currently in force, an ongoing war with Russian troops on the ground throughout most of this period, including as we speak, as fire is being exchanged. Okay, that was my little chronological summary. Now let me try to break this out in terms of tactics, strategy, and philosophy from a Russian perspective. Okay, the tactics. As I'm not the only person to observe, tactics are the strong part of the Russian reorientation. It's at the tactical level that the Russians have been most successful, and perhaps too successful in the sense of going too far, too fast, going beyond their own strategy and their own political planning. Why do I say too far, too fast? And why are the tactics here so important? Well, before we begin to marvel at the spectacular character of the takeover of the Crimean Peninsula, we need to remember what that followed. It followed what I take to be the biggest disaster in Russian foreign policy, in the history of independent Russia, which is only 25 years long, but probably the greatest miscalculation in the Kremlin since spring of 1941, when Stalin was sure that Hitler was not going to invade. The run of Russian foreign policy from November of 13 to February of 2014, or March, is a total disaster across every front. You start in November with an essentially compliant Ukrainian government, right? By the time you get to February and March, you've lost that. You've lost your man, you've lost your government, you've lost Ukrainian popular opinion, and you're on your way to losing your relationship with the West. Moreover, once you take Crimea, you've pushed Russia towards China in a few months in a way which otherwise probably would have taken decades. In other words, you've lost Russia's basic strategic asset, which is the ability to balance between the European Union and China by alienating the European Union. Moreover, you've admitted this by going to China and signing an economic deal which is clearly not in your own interests. So this was a terrible run of Russian foreign policy, a disastrous run. And this is the one thing, of course, that Russian foreign policy elites cannot say, cannot face, to their own public opinion, to themselves, to us, right? This is somewhere deep in a closet. It is covered up by, for us and for them, and for Russian public opinion so far, I think not for much longer, by the tremendous success of tactics. The tremendous success of tactics I would put under the heading of something called reverse asymmetry. Okay, what do I mean by reverse asymmetry? Asymmetrical warfare is a general, there are those of you here who know a lot about this. Asymmetrical warfare is what a weaker opponent does with a stronger. It can go under various names: partisan warfare, terrorism, fourth generation blurs into it. But the idea is the weapons of the weak, right? If you are a non-state adversary facing a strong conventional army, what do? Well, you might not wear uniforms, you might shoot from the houses of civilians, right? You might use illegal weapons. I think the most striking thing about the Russian campaign, the Russian war against Ukraine, is that it is a kind of reverse asymmetry. They are the stronger party in this war, and by a lot, right? The Ukrainian army practically doesn't exist. They are the stronger party, and yet they're using the weapons of the weak, right? They're using the weapons of the weak, and all of them. They're refusing to admit that they're actually carrying out a war. When they initially invade Crimea, they don't mark their own uniforms, although of course later they admit that those were Russian soldiers. In that fundamental way, they behave not like a state, because when a state makes war, declared or not, it admits that it's the one that's making the war. The people who invaded Crimea initially claimed to be from the local civilian population, which of course they weren't, but in that way they were imitating partisans, taking part in a partisan war. In February, Putin announced to general confusion that the use of human shields was going to be a Russian tactic, which in Crimea it was, and then in Donetsk and Luhansk it also was. That is a typical weapon of the week, a typical example of asymmetric warfare. In Donetsk and Luhansk, in the southeastern oblasts of Ukraine, this reverse asymmetry took on a slightly different form. It meant support for rather small local insurgencies, followed by the insertion of military intelligence and Russian special forces into Ukraine, which was then this summer followed by an open invasion. I mean, open in every sense of the word, except that the Russians denied that it was happening, but obviously visible to everyone involved when absolutely necessary. Now, I think there are two things that are very interesting about this that are worth remembering. Three things, maybe. The first is that this reverse asymmetry is part of an idea, which is that Russia is not the aggressor, and in fact that Russia is not really a great power, that Russia is a small power, that nothing is Russia's fault, right? Because if you take the pose of asymmetric warfare, if you say, well, we're just the small guys, we're just the civilians, we're just the ones who are being a victim, that's your argument that you can do anything you want, right? Because there's some huge, amazing enemy which is going to crush you otherwise. In this war, as it stands, there is actually not that enemy. They're just the Ukrainian armed forces. There are a few battalions. It's not really anything very impressive. So the logic of this asymmetry is that we're fighting the United States, right? That's the logic of it. We're fighting a world war against the United States. And so it hangs together with that particular propaganda. The second thing which is interesting about this reverse asymmetry is the political problem that it creates inside Russia itself. Because if you claim that you're not actually fighting a war, then you can set yourself up for a difficult problem in public opinion. So, for example, right now, the huge majority of the Russian population, the huge majority, opposes a war in Ukraine. A huge majority opposes a war in Ukraine, right? And that is only possible because that huge majority does not think a war is being fought in Ukraine, right? In other words, the propaganda associated with this asymmetrical war works in some parts of the world. But it isn't going to work forever, and that is a limit, a political limit, but also a strategic limit on this kind of war. The limit is the number of Russians who are killed, and that limit is probably much lower than we tend to think. Putin's muscular claim is that, many Russians could die, but how many Soviet mortal casualties were taken in the Afghan war? 16,000, right? A small number, even compared to Vietnam, which is a small number on the American side. Right, not on the Vietnamese side, which was a huge number, but a small number, right? If the Soviet Union in 1979 could take 16,000, how many do we really think that the Russian Federation could take today? That the Pskov Battalion loses a few dozen people, and it's already a political problem, right, in Russia today. So there's a limit in this, and the limit is that insofar as you lose your actual soldiers, then you have to admit to your civilian population that perhaps we are fighting a war, and we already know that a war is unpopular. Putin is popular because it appears that he's winning without fighting a war. The moment it appears that he has to fight a war, he's going to have a problem, right? Which means that his position is perhaps a little more vulnerable than he's making it out to us to be. The third thing which is interesting, or in this case I should say tragic, about this kind of tactic is that partisan warfare, by its nature, involves civilians. Partisan warfare by its nature is about drawing civilians into the middle of the conflict, not just here and there as necessary as human shields, but as a kind of political mass to be moved around. So if you're fighting a partisan war, if you're leading a partisan unit, one of the things you do is you deliberately provoke the other side to destroy villages and towns and cities. Because if it does, that's going to alienate the civilians and they might go to your side, right? This is just what partisans do. It's the logic of partisan warfare. It has nothing to do with whether you're a good guy or a bad guy or a communist or an anti-communist. That is what you do. You use the power of the state. It's judo. You use the power of the state against the state. You get the state to shell some cities, then people are upset. That is, of course, what has happened in Donetsk and Luhansk, right? I mean, major cities, European cities of more than 1 million population, are being shelled by their own state because the armies there are fighting not a conventional war, but a partisan war where they are literally firing from civilian buildings, right? And that has the political effect that more people are alienated from the Ukrainian state. It also has the effect And I'm just going to note this, although in some sense it's the most significant thing that I'm going to say today. It also has the effect that we're facing a huge humanitarian disaster in Donetsk and Luhansk. There are millions of people now, millions of Europeans, millions of people right in the middle of Europe who are missing some combination of food, water, access to internet, electricity, right, and gas. And moreover, there are tremendous parts of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts where money doesn't even work anymore, where people are reduced to a barter economy, which means that the relief of that humanitarian situation, insofar as it's possible, is something which ought to be in everyone's minds. Okay, that's an important parenthesis, but I'm gonna close it. Now, what are the goals of these tactics? It's very hard to say exactly what Putin is after, and in my opinion, that's a rabbit hole down which we probably should not go, partly because I think there is no there, and partly because I think it's changing all of the time. But insofar as there's one, if we just follow what Putin has been saying, the thing which is clearest is that the goal is the destruction of the Ukrainian state. The reason that I say that this is so clear is that the absence of the Ukrainian state has been announced in so many ways already, I mean at least half a dozen ways. The idea that there is no Ukrainian nation, that Russians and Ukrainians are the same people. The idea which was used when, you remember the Budapest, we all remember the Budapest Memorandum, you know, some of us were there. When the Russians explained why the Budapest Memorandum no longer obliged them, their official explanation, I think Lavrov actually said this, was that since the Ukrainian state no longer exists, it is not a party to that treaty, that understanding, therefore the understanding no longer binds anyone. Now the crucial thing is that premise, since the Ukrainian state no longer exists, right? So in that context, a very important one, it was announced. The claim that, another thing is the semantic habit. This is especially clear with the Russian Deputy Prime Minister Rogozin, the semantic habit of not referring to Ukraine, but referring to Nazi fascist junta. Instead of saying Ukraine, you say Nazi fascist junta, Nazi fascist junta, Nazi fascist junta. It's a kind of, it is almost like a rap the way he does it. You just, instead of saying Ukraine, you just say Nazi fascist junta. And that is a way of denying that there's a Ukraine, of course, right? If instead of saying America, we said Nazi fascist junta, like you pretty quickly get the idea that somebody was denying that you exist, unless you happen to be part of a Nazi fascist junta, of course, in which case you would be an exception. So this business of claiming that all Ukrainians are fascists and so on, and that these democratically elected governments are fascists, that's another way of saying that Ukraine doesn't exist. The idea of Novorossiya, right, the idea that we should be all talking about the 19th century instead of the 21st, is another way of saying Ukraine doesn't exist. The idea of Ruski Mir, which means that instead of there being countries with boundaries on a map, there are spheres of linguistic civilization. That's another way of saying that Ukraine doesn't exist, right? If that logic were true, then America wouldn't exist because we would be part of some Anglophone world. If Ruski Mir were true, that means, you know, Ukraine and Belarus don't exist. Brooklyn also doesn't exist because they're all part of some Russian world. And okay, so we all love Brooklyn, but it's a serious point. Ruski Mir is a serious point because what it comes down to is, you know, what used to be called ethnic nationalism. If I can say that you belong to my nation because you speak my language and I have the right to protect you, you no longer have any subjectivity, right? You are just someone who is part of my field of interests, part of my sphere of power. You're no longer a person, you're no longer a state, or you're no longer a person. If we allow that kind of ethnic thinking to be accepted, then the whole basis of international sovereignty goes away. Anyway, so the tactics and the implication of the tactics, the destruction of the Ukrainian state, are bad enough, but much worse is the strategy. And the strategy is what I want to spend a bit of time with now. I think the strategy is something that can only be defined as relativism. Okay? I think the approach that the Kremlin has taken is best defined as a kind of strategic relativism. What do I mean by that? Let me start from something that folks inside the Beltway have, I think, a bad habit of stressing, which is Russia's objective weakness. Okay, all true. Technologically, there are limits. Demographically, there are limits. In the alliance structure, limits. Russia doesn't have strong allies. In ideology, there are limits too. Russia faces a lot of limits. In objective terms, it is in many ways a very weak state, especially given its size. However, one of the things that we learn, if we take political science classes during our misspent youth, is that power is relative. It's always relative. There is no such thing as absolute power. So if you are objectively weak, if you are limited in what you can do in absolute terms, the way to become strong is to become relatively strong. And the way to become relatively strong is to make other people weaker. Now, in the case of Russia's concrete situation, the strength of Russia's rivals, adversaries, enemies depends largely upon their connections with each other, right? So in most respects, the European Union is spectacularly more powerful than the Russian Federation in most respects, but only insofar as European states are connected one with another, politically, socially, economically, morally. And so in that light, it's worth reconsidering the turn in Russian foreign policy against the European Union since summer and autumn of 2013. What this business of decadence means, or how it can be understood anyway, is as a form of attack, right? If Europe is defined as it is, not as Europe, but as some kind of diversion, indeed some kind of perversion from true European history, right? As not as decadent and homosexual, this is how this all plays in. Europe is homosexual. It actually can't be overemphasized how strongly this aspect has been used. If Europe is decadent in the sense of falling apart and in the sense of having abandoned its own core values, then it is doomed. And then Russia lays the claim to being the stronghold, the only protector of the actual Europe. That is the ideology of the Eurasian Union, that Europe has all gone astray, right? From Scandinavia to Italy, from Portugal to Poland, it's all gone astray. It's one big garbage heap, it's one big moral abyss. But Russia, on the other hand, is morally healthy, it's Christian, and so on. Now, anyone who pays any attention to statistics like abortion rates and so on knows that this kind of thing doesn't, or even homosexuality, right? Anyone who knows anything about homosexuality in Russia knows that this kind of thing doesn't make any sense, but that's not the point. The point is that this is an ideological claim about the future. And it's an ideological claim which is backed by action. Right? Now, again, I don't know how much play this has gotten on this side of the Atlantic, but it's quite clear that there is a very specific policy in the Kremlin to support the political forces in Europe who are against European integration, or to put it more precisely, who are in favor of the European Union falling apart. The very mild form of that are funny incidents like the Russians announcing that they're going to protest the outcome of the Scottish referendum, right? Because they're in favor of separatism. Right? If Scotland had separated, that might well have set off something rather disastrous, by the way. The nastier form of this is Russian support of European right-wing populism. In the most dramatic example is France, where, as you might have noticed, the right-wing populist party, the Front National, is now on the verge of becoming a mainstream party at all levels, nationally and locally. The Front National openly admits that it is a partner to Putin and that it is carrying out, almost word by word, that we're carrying out Russian foreign policy. The United Kingdom Independence Party, its leader, also makes very clear that Putin is the European politician he most admires, and when asked to recall that comment, he has expanded upon it in various ways. The same thing is true of populists in Austria and other sensitive parts of the European Union. Now, it goes beyond the populists. The Russian foreign policy is, and I think this is a mistake on their part because it's counterproductive, but it's true. It also includes the financial and moral and logistical support of neo-fascist and neo-Nazi parties who are asked to take part in gatherings in European capitals with Russian political theorists such as Alexander Dugin, who are invited to the Crimea. I just don't know what was a news story here, but when the Crimean referendum happened, Putin, because it was a referendum, you had to have observers. And so the observers were Nazis and fascists, quite literally. I'm not joking. They were representatives of Europe's fringe, fascist, and Nazi parties. Yes, I can give you the whole list. I can give you the whole list. I can give you the whole list. Send me an email, I'll send you the whole list. I'll give you the whole list. Or read if you'd like the full report and the names and the photographs, go to Anton Chekhovtsov's article. I recommend it to you all right? I wouldn't want to get any names wrong since I'm speaking here, but read Anton Chekhovtsov's article from March of 2014. It will give you the names of the fascists and the Nazis. The only ones who weren't fascists or Nazis or right-wing populists were two members of the German post-communist party Die Linke, which is very interesting. Okay, so in these ways, Russian foreign policy has connected itself to the European right with the very clear purpose of destabilizing the European integration project. This policy works on other levels as well. There is the straightforward seduction of heads of government and state, for example, Gerhard Schröder. There is the attempt to push through South Stream, the project of a natural gas pipeline, which has no purpose but a political one, and the associated recruitment of Bulgarian, Croatian, and Serbian parliamentarians. Now, once one understands this, once one understands that the Russian rhetorical and political turn against the European Union is actually policy, then the crisis in Ukraine looks very different. Then one can begin to understand that the crisis in Ukraine is not actually about Ukraine. And I say this with full respect for all the people in Ukraine who are suffering much more directly than the other Europeans. But the crisis in Ukraine is not actually about Ukraine. The crisis in Ukraine is about the European Union. Ukraine is at the front end of a policy which is designed to destabilize the European Union. The assault was on both from the beginning. Ukraine is vulnerable in various ways that Europe is not, but the assault has been on both from the very beginning. Now, this has an interesting policy implication, for our policy, which is that if this is true, if I'm right about this, that means that Russian policy towards Ukraine cannot be decoupled from Russian European policy. And we can't expect Russian policy towards Ukraine to change until Russia's orientation towards Europe changes. I would point out that the evidence thus far bears this out. So there have been many announced Russian foreign policy changes towards Ukraine, but none of them has actually turned out to be true, which at least suggests, that this is part of a larger European initiative. Now, I think that Russia's policy towards Europe can, and probably in the interests of Russia, should change. I think that's possible, but I think only that would lead to a change in policy towards Ukraine. I think the idea that Washington and Moscow can get together, or the OSCE can do it, I think that's an illusion, because I think the Ukrainian policy is an element of European policy, and the European policy would have to change first. Okay, the next level of the strategic relativism has to do with civil society. And again, I think part of this will be more and part of it will be less familiar to you depending upon your own experiences and references. If we think back to the way that Russian television and Russian political leadership talked about the Maidan, that is, talked about the protests in Ukraine in December of 13 and in early 2014, the basic presumption, the point of consensus, was that this cannot really be happening, right? This is not actually happening. It cannot be the case that a couple of million people have chosen to gather and take risks in order to defend a trade agreement, or in order to defend Europe, or in order to defend the rule of law. Something else must be happening. And that other thing which was happening was, of course, that the CIA was organizing it, or that the European Union was organizing it, or that Sweden was organizing it, or that the international gay lobby was organizing it. These things were all very much in the mix. Now, the obvious thing to say about the Maidan, and it's been said 1,000 times before, is that this kind of gathering, this kind of example of civil society activism is threatening to a Russian regime. After all, if a couple of million of Russian speakers in Ukraine can overturn a regime, why could they not do it in Russia? Right. And by the way, for all of this nonsense about how, there's, I'll get back to the language question, but that's the obvious point. But there's a less obvious point. The idea that the Maidan can't exist isn't just about Ukraine. It's about something much broader. It's about civil society. Obviously, in Russia, in the same time, right, and for the same reasons, civil society has been having considerable problems. The enforcement, for example, of the law about registering as a foreign agent comes in right at the same time. So at the same time that people are being shot and killed in Ukraine, institutions are being forced to register as foreign agents inside Russia. Now, but the depth of this, unfortunately, is considerably greater. When you argue, so conspiracy theories, and now I'm following Hannah Arendt a bit. Conspiracy theories aren't just mistakes, right? Conspiracy theories represent a view of the world. If you think that the Maidan cannot actually be happening, right, or that Memorial, for example, cannot really be exemplifying some organic trend in Russian society, you're taking a certain view about the world. And the view about the world that you're taking is that freely chosen horizontal organizations of human beings don't exist, right? They don't really exist. They're always part of some larger plot. Now, the problem with this is, though, it might be a mistake. It might be a mistake. It's an enforceable mistake, right? It might not be true, but you can make it true, right? That is the history of the Soviet Union, and that's one way the history of the Soviet Union is relevant. It is, those things might exist in reality, but you can make them stop existing, and then they don't exist anymore, and then you're right. So the notion that the Maidan exists, and then the notion the Maidan doesn't exist, or the notion that civil society doesn't exist, reflects literally a kind of worldview, something which can be imposed on the world. Now, and it doesn't, and by the way, it's a worldview in the literal sense. This argument doesn't stop in Kiev or in Moscow. It's also applied to Washington, D.C., right? We also don't have civil society. All of our think tanks are puppets on strings, right? All of us here right now are puppets on strings. There is none of you chose to be here. I didn't choose to be here either. It's all explicable by, I'm not sure what exactly binds all of you and me together, except that we've all probably already had lunch, but we are all somehow puppets on a string. This is the way that, DC think tank culture is presented. And of course, by funding DC think tanks, right, or by revealing that others do so, the Russians have a good deal of fun with this particular argument. And it goes further than that, right? Western institutions like newspapers are also under attack. It's not just that newspapers are in trouble in Russia. The idea in Germany, right, that German journalists are only critical of Russia when they're paid by the CIA is being spread. And something interesting is going on here. And it's not just that civil society is impossible, and this is the final thing I want to say about Russia before I move on. This represents a certain kind of philosophy, a very tempting and effective one, and it is, and I stress it's tempting and effective because I want to make sure that we all understand that this is a serious challenge. How I would call this philosophy is something like applied postmodernism. All right. Now, for those of you who didn't have the happy experience like me of going to college in America in the 1980s, this may take a couple steps back. So I'm going to take a couple steps back. What do I mean by applied postmodernism? Well, let me first start out with some silly examples. Applied postmodernism basically means copying certain aspects of cultural trends that were popular here in the US in the 90s and the early 2000s, taking them to their logical extreme and using them for political purposes. Okay, let me give you an example that we all know. You're watching an advertisement for an automobile, right? It's a fantastic automobile. It's like driving up a mountain. It gets to the top of the mountain. It flies into the air. It does something totally impossible, right? And then at the bottom of the ad, there are little words scrolling across which say, this is for illustrative purposes only, right? In other words, this can't actually happen. Right? Or you go by a grocery store and there are all kinds of fantastic things advertised, and at the bottom it says, for illustrative purposes only, right? So this isn't what we actually have in the store, it's just kind of a pretty picture, okay? So last week, Russia was distributing atrocity propaganda about the Ukrainian army and its treatment of Russian prisoners of war. And with the atrocity propaganda, it was a nice email, probably some of you got it. There was a photo of a German concentration camp, right? And what was the qualification? For illustrative purposes only, right? This isn't actually what we're telling you about, but we're trying to put a certain idea in your mind, right? And that was actually the explanation. It's for illustrative purposes only. Likewise, marketing, okay? So the two main trends in Russian political propaganda are the Ukrainians are all fascists, and this is all a geopolitical struggle, okay? Now, each of those is targeted at a certain political market. The Ukrainians are all fascists is targeted at the European left, obviously. It's all a geopolitical struggle is targeted at Europeans who want to think either it's America's fault or it's America's responsibility. Since if it's a geopolitical struggle, that means America must have started it somehow, so let them take care of it, right? So these are aiming at certain kinds of markets, and that's basically the only kind of validity they have. They have a kind of market validity. Now, going a little bit deeper into postmodernity, one of the central ideas of postmodernity is that there is not reliable truth. There's only a kind of cacophony of voices expressing various opinions, right? Now, that has been institutionalized very beautifully in Russia Today, right? This is how Russia Today presents the news. Fox News does it too. Russia Today does it better, okay? They've taken what Fox News does and they do it much, I'm sorry, it's true, they do it much better. And the way it works is this. When something happens, for example, a Malaysian Airlines flight is shot down out of the sky, right? When something happens, rather than covering it or trying to figure out what happens, you turn it into a kind of game. You bring in 5 or 6 people to the studio, and each of them has an opinion, right? My opinion is that the Americans did it. My opinion is that the Ukrainians did it. And at the end of the day, it is not just that you've trivialized a tragedy for which perhaps you should be taking responsibility, right? It's not just that. It's something worse. You've also trivialized the idea of journalism, right? You've trivialized the very idea that people might actually be trying to figure out what's going on. And as I've mentioned before, the same kinds of things are happening at the level of think tanks, newspapers, historians, whatever source of authority that you consider, this is happening. Now, I think this is part of a philosophical conviction, but at the very least, it is an element. At the very least, the minimal claim is this is an element of a political strategy. If you create a world which is this slippery, in which there is no authority, right? In which everyone laughs at truth, we're all cynics, nothing's true, right? Who knows? If you can create that world, that very slippery world, then the slimiest wins. In a slippery world, the people who are good at being slimy are always going to win. So you make the world as slippery as you possibly can, and that equalizes. That's a kind of equalizer. All right. By the way, the other way, I should have mentioned this earlier, but the other way that this propaganda works is that it's an appeal to laziness, and this is most relevant to policy making. This business about the Maidan being all fascists and Nazis and so on, that filled up the news wavelength, right? It filled up the space which was needed for figuring out what was actually happening for about 4 months. In Europe and to some extent the United States, rather than talking about what was essentially actually a left-wing revolution, a kind of left-wing bourgeois revolution in favor of the rule of law. Instead, we were all distracted by how these people might be Nazis. And that means you can't make policy, or it's harder to make policy. I mean, with respect to my friends and colleagues who do, it's harder to make policy in that atmosphere when the debate is about things that aren't actually happening. Geopolitical struggle has the same effect. It's harder for Europeans to make policy, and this is something I experience, when their public opinions believe that this is a geopolitical struggle. Because if it's the Americans' fault, or it's the Americans' responsibility, why should we even be involved, right? So that threw off the Europeans for, I'd say, another good 3 or 4 months. They are recovering, they have recovered, but the delay itself is a consequential aspect of the propaganda. Okay, now this business, this postmodernism, it goes one level deeper, and I'd ask you to follow me there if you can. George Kennan, reporting from Moscow, said something very profound. I think it was in 1944. He said, "Here men determine what is true and what is false." And what he meant, of course, was that the truth was a matter of politics, and therefore it was subject to radical alteration all the time. I think what's happening now is in a way more interesting and perhaps more threatening than that. Because what's happening now is a kind of open abandonment at the level of political speech of truth itself. And by truth, I don't mean anything fancy. I mean the Aristotelian principle of non-contradiction. Right? That I can't be both here and not here. I can't be both here, speaking to you and not speaking to you. So let me give you some basic examples. And please, if these aren't familiar to you, let me know, because these examples are they're right in the center of what Moscow has been doing in the last 8 months. So if this hasn't been reaching, and this is unfamiliar, let me know. So let me just put some claims together for you. There is no Ukrainian state. But the Ukrainian state is very repressive. There is no Ukrainian nation. But all Ukrainians are nationalists. There is no Ukrainian language. but Russians are being forced to speak it, right? Russia is a great power. Russia is a small power being pushed around by everyone else. Russia is saving Europe from fascism, and this is the deepest, darkest one. Russia is saving Europe from fascism, but fascism is not such a bad thing. Right? All of those claims are being made at the same time. What does that mean? And what does it mean if that's not immediately apparent to us? What does it mean if, like, the simple logical contradiction doesn't matter to us? The fascism thing I find particularly disturbing. What does it mean when a government which has a gay obsession, pursues an ethnic foreign policy, has undertaken a partial rehabilitation of Hitler's foreign policy, carries out Nuremberg-style rallies, has a cult of the leader, and supports fascists in Europe and in eastern Ukraine? What does it mean when it presents itself as anti-fascist and we don't immediately notice? What does that mean? It suggests that we've all gone pretty far down this particular rabbit hole. Okay, so what then to get to the end? What then can be done? The history of Ukraine, compared to all this, amazingly enough, is relatively straightforward. I mean, it's a complicated subject. It's something that I work on myself. But against this setting, what actually has happened in Ukraine and the main lines of Ukrainian history are fairly straightforward. Ukraine is a new political nation, like Austria, for example, or like Russia, for that matter. Its identity is still very much in negotiation. We know certain things about it. We know that most Ukrainians, when asked, identify with Europe. We know that most Ukrainians, when asked, would like to join the European Union. We know that Ukrainians were ready to sacrifice in fairly large numbers for Europe, and that they're also willing to sacrifice, many of them, right now in this war. It's not, by the way, a trivial thing to fight a war against Russia when you have no army. I wish this war were not taking place. It's a terrible thing for Ukraine in pretty much every way. But nevertheless, if we're talking about Ukrainian history, it is a rather striking thing that people are willing to fight Russia when there is basically no Ukrainian army. It's a country which had free and fair presidential elections in May, free and fair parliamentary elections yesterday, in which the main three pro-European parties, as I'm sure you know, came in 1, 2, and 3 in the elections, in which populists did quite badly. The main problem in Ukraine today, as anyone here who has contemplated Ukraine at all or has been there knows, is the same as it was 20 years ago or 10 years ago or 5 years ago. The main problem in Ukraine is actually not Russia or the war. The main problem in Ukraine is the rule of law. That is the thing which unites the protesters on the Maidan, and indeed many of the protesters against the Maidan, the totally justified belief that power in the center is corrupt, and the desire to have predictability and the rule of law, which is what leads to the popularity precisely of Europe. So then, what can be done? I mean, despite, in addition to this to be or not to be question, which I think is the real question, what might be done? On the European side, it seems very clear that Ukraine could be offered a membership prospect. That is to say, not that you were invited to join the European Union, but that we are considering this as a possibility in the future. This has the happy effect that it attracts foreign direct investment. One of the places, incidentally, it would attract foreign direct investment from is Russia. There are a lot of Russian investors who are looking for a Russian-speaking place to put their money. Ukraine, under a European regime, would be one of those places. In the present moment, with Ukraine hovering on the edge of bankruptcy, it would probably be a good thing to reward sets of free elections with major financial support. The overall European tonality of austerity makes no sense whatsoever for a country that is fighting a war, not only for its own existence, but in some sense for the existence of Europe itself. A good deal of this aid, I think, should be keyed to humanitarian assistance for the parts of the southeast which are under control of the Ukrainian army, Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts. You may think that both of those oblasts are under Russian control. That's not quite true. Parts of both of them are. In these elections, about half of the people in Luhansk were able to vote, and about a quarter of the people in Donetsk were able to vote, which is a kind of signal of how much is under whose control. Anyway, the parts that are under the control of Ukraine should be rebuilt as quickly as possible. This is the only way to avoid a horrible catastrophe as winter comes. I'm just going to mark that a second time. In general, I would make the claim that the best Russia policy is a good Ukraine policy. The West's ability to influence Russia, I think, is limited for various reasons. I think the sanctions are a good idea, but and I think consideration of natural gas and oil also makes sense. But the best Russia policy is a good Ukrainian policy. If the Ukrainian state can be helped to push through, that in the long run is the best way to talk to Russian society, I think, and the Russian leadership. In a much broader way, if it is true, I mean, if I'm right about the strategic relativism, then the question is being posed to us about the reality or the sincerity of our own associations, how much we believe in truth, at least in a limited sense of journalistic truth or historical truth, how much we care about our own civil society organizations and where they're funded, how much we care about the integrity of states, whether we really believe in that, how much we care about the European Union, which is after all an association of states, how much we care about the transatlantic partnership. It seems to me, by the way, from an American point of view, that the 20 years where we got to make fun of the European Union and call it decadent and point out, the Muslims, the social welfare state, it all can't last, I think that moment's over. I think we should probably stop that now, if we haven't stopped it already, because it's a luxury we can't afford. And as I've already pointed out, it is one of the sources of Russian anti-European propaganda, which is worth thinking about. All right, the European Union is what we've got. The transatlantic relationship is what we've got. We should be aware that a turn has been made and that Russian policy is no longer mainly about the United States. It's mainly about the European Union. They talk about the United States because the United States is a cleavage issue inside European publics. So if you claim that it's all about NATO or all about the Americans, if you claim that the Americans have landed on Crimea, if you claim that Blackwater is in Donetsk, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, these are all things that have been claimed, including some more dramatic things. That is a cleavage issue inside Germany and France and Italy. It's also a cleavage issue in this country. But the real aim is the European Union. They're using us as a kind of rhetorical cover, which is intelligent. The final thing, though, and this is really where I will close, is that in order to start making sound policy, and I hope this doesn't sound too simplistic, it's pretty important to be able to hold on to basic elements of truthfulness and to recognize that some things are fairly simple. An authoritarian state has invaded a democratic state, basically breaking, if not destroying, an international order. All of the qualifiers that one could add to that statement, like that they didn't wear insignia on their uniforms, make it worse rather than better. We have to remember that what I presented as tactics, strategy, and philosophy can also be presented in exactly the other order. That is, the philosophy itself can be presented as the tactics. If we accept this kind of applied postmodernity, if we're really not sure what's going on, if it's who knows, if we're tempted by strategic relativism, we can then expect to lose a whole number of asymmetric wars, like this one. So if you go for the philosophy, then you'll lose on the tactical level in the long run. It seems to me that this much as none of this is in the interest of Russia, it is nevertheless a very serious challenge, political, intellectual, and moral for the West, one which we have to take extremely seriously. Not just an everyday challenge from which one can pivot from one to the other, but actually a question of who we are. And I think in all earnestness, it's a moment where it's worth reading things like Kennan's Long Telegram, or especially Orwell's Politics of the English Language, or Orwell's 1984, to remind ourselves what clarity in concepts is and why it's so important in moments like this. Because when you lose clarity of concepts, you're on the way to losing the politics and on the way to losing the tactics as well. Or another way of putting it, if what we think is happening now in Ukraine is just a matter of a few oblasts, more or less, if we just see it as business as usual, or something which is a conflict about a faraway country of which we know little, if we just see it that way, then in fact we've already lost. Thanks.
Okay, great. That was very wide-ranging and encompassing, so thank you. Thanks for mentioning the concerns about think tanks in Washington being puppets on a string. It's an issue that we've been struggling with. It's a concern not only in Russia, but here, and I think you've put your finger on something that a lot of us have been concerned about. If I could just start, I guess, I really like this idea of applied postmodernity as a way of thinking about the way that Russia is approaching not only the crisis in Ukraine, but Europe and the US as well. And it's kind of striking because the image that we have of Russia and the image that Putin is giving of Russia is one that is committed to kind of long-standing universal principles of capital T truth, right? But underlying it is this sense of moral, historical, ideological relativism in a way that has, a long historical pedigree. And, you talked about Kennan, and you can think about what the Soviets were up to in Eastern Europe in the 1940s. I guess, the question that I would ask before we kind of open it up to a broader discussion is, where do you locate the origins of this turn towards seeing the EU as the source of, or seeing Europe as the source of threat in Russia? Because if we think back only 4 or 5 years, we had Medvedev in the Kremlin, and we had talk about modernization partnerships with the EU, and we had common spaces, and we had talk about deeper cooperation between Russia and NATO. And now, even before the crisis in Ukraine started, some of the trends that you highlighted had already begun taking off. And so not only in terms of temporal, in terms of the timeline, but also in terms of what accounts for this shift in the way that Russia thinks about the EU. Why has there been suddenly this emphasis on decadence?
Okay. So in response to your earlier, to the remarks that you made at the very beginning, I think it's important to note that in some respects this is, it's different and in a way more dangerous, more appealing than Soviet communism and its approach to truth, at least in the late days. Because with the Soviets, and Marxism was a common language, and Marxism spoke to liberalism, liberalism spoke to Marxism, even conservatives knew perfectly well what Marxism was. It was a kind of language, it was a claim about what was true and what was not, with which one could disagree or agree, but it was definitely modern. It was in some modern world of rhetoric and discourse. And even when people no longer believed in it, it still had a set of concepts on which one could hang something. I think we're now in a different place. When I say we, I mean us as well as the Russians. I mean, what's interesting about Russia, one of the many things which are fascinating about Russia, is the way that it reflects American trends. Which is one of the interesting things about anti-American, like pro-Russian anti-Americanism, is that Russia has all the beautiful things we have, but more so, right? So when I say we, I actually mean everyone from San Francisco, to Vladivostok. But to answer your question, I think there are 3 levels. One is that for whatever reason, and this I can't explain to you, it is true according to polling, like the World Values Survey, that Russian society is tilting towards the right on these social conservative questions, uniquely actually in the Eurasian space, or in the European space anyway, which incidentally makes it different than Ukraine. In Ukraine, public opinion, following the same surveys, is tilting more towards standard European positions. And this, by the way, is a broad set of empirical data which is useful for people who are asking like what's similar about Russians and Ukrainians and what's different. Attitudes towards social conservatism are different. Not radically, it's not like Scandinavia versus Russia, but the trend is clearly there. Likewise, the trend as to who identifies with Europe or not. Russia's going one way and Ukraine is going the other way, which is a kind of bread and butter way of asking, what political identity actually means. But so that's one underlying thing. The overtly conservative rhetoric is speaking to some change inside Russian society. A second level is, of course, politics. I'm not at all the first person to point out that this is a response to protests in Russia itself, that Putin seems to have made a decision that he's going to base his continuing regime less on the middle classes and more on the lower classes, and this in turn probably corresponds to a style and a practice, especially insofar as style outruns practice and style becomes practice, which is populist and short-term. rather than thoughtful and long-term. So, I mean, Crimea was a classic, I think, populist overreach in that it didn't really make any sense at all. It was clearly done in a fit of emotion, but it was hugely popular, and then once it becomes popular, you can't really very well step back from that. So that's the second level. I think there's a change inside Russia itself. And the third thing I think is contingent. I mean, Eurasianism, and this seems to have been associated with the rise of Sergei Glazyev. In particular, you probably have been following this more closely than I think there's some contingent things at the top of Russian power circles which are associated with this. But then, that said, I think it all got out of their hands. I mean, I think there is an emotional, there's a mistake. I mean, it's not just our mistake. I think Putin actually made a mistake about Ukraine, and so much of this has to do with covering up that mistake. The mistake was we can actually get them by threatening Yanukovych with Crimea or by paying them off. I mean, if you really think that there isn't a Ukrainian society or a Ukrainian nation, you'll miscalculate because there's something wrong in your axioms. And I think there's an element just of miscalculation in all of this. And I mean, this is what I argued back in December when I claimed that this is going to end in a war. And I think that actually was borne out. If you miscalculate in that way, you end up getting more involved than you think, and then you have to ratchet up the propaganda about Europe, which is what's happened.
Okay, let's open it up to questions now. Raise your hand when I call you. Please identify yourself, and please, please, please ask a question. Okay, Andy. And yeah, wait for a microphone.
Andy Cutchin, CSIS. Thanks, Tim. That was a brilliant lecture. I really enjoyed it. I just spent last week at the Valdai Discussion Club, and I think you helped to contextualize much of my experience. In fact, a number of times there were comments in that Americans, Europeans, and Russians seem to we've lost a commonality of language. It's very hard to talk to each other because we are associating very different things with the things that we're saying, and there are categories and our terminology. I also had to laugh. I did a 28-minute interview with Russia Today last Thursday morning that was broadcast on Sunday, and talk about being in the maelstrom of your applied postmodernism. It was quite an experience. At one point, I had made a comment in a congressional testimony on April 3rd that historians may regard Putin's speech on March 18th as the day that Russia tipped from Weimar Russia to a fascist state. And they contested me on that. And I said, well, just look up the definition of fascism in the dictionary, the kind of corporatist state structure plus a highly chauvinistic type of nationalism, and it's a fascist state. I know it's a loaded word. Then she immediately responded, well, then by that definition, then isn't the United States a fascist state? So, well, no, I don't agree with that, but let's move on and get away from the name calling. I don't think my question, you're saying that the Russian policy in Ukraine is primarily a reflection of the Europe policy, and I agree with all of that. But then I would take the one step further, and you may not, in fact, disagree with this based on your comment, that the Europe policy is is more about Russian domestic politics. And here, Mike, what I see is that when Putin returned to the presidency in 2012, Putin had been popular for most of the 14, now almost 15 years that he's been in power, de facto and/or de jure, because of economic growth and prosperity for Russians. I think that's the principal thing. Although he's a master at defining the political narrative. I'll give him that. But since he's returned to the presidency, the Russian economic growth, even before Ukraine, had already fallen from a level of about 4% to close to zero before the annexation, the military occupation, annexation of Crimea. And if he's not going to have economic growth and prosperity to be a go-to for his political popularity, then how are you going to justify to the Russian people your dictatorship for life and/or the afterlife? And I think it's a combination of what you described to me domestically, sort of this conservative trend that reminds me a bit of Nicholas I, official nationality policy, autocracy, orthodoxy, Russian nationality, people, etc., plus this sort of aggressive, assertive foreign policy. Would you put his Europe policy in the context of primarily just as a justification for his consolidation of his political regime for
Okay,
a
thank
while.
you. I mean, every remark you make is thoughtful, and there's no particular point where I disagree, but I'm going to spin off a couple of different directions. With fascism in your experience on Russia today, it strikes me there are a couple of really serious things to be said about all this. One is the way in which the thoughtless, constant deployment of terms like fascism delegitimizes history as such, right? So fascism is a serious business, as is anti-fascism, and when it's used all the time on a hair trigger, it ceases to have any meaning. Or to put it a different way, what fascism clearly means, from the point of view of a lot of folks in Russia, is something which is bad, and if you put all the bad on that side, then we can monopolize the good. It's a way of creating a Manichaean world. But when you use it that way all the time, then it becomes increasingly unclear what the content of the term might be. And that's leaving aside the fact that there are some quite concerning tendencies inside Russia itself. I mean, I would even go so far as to say that if your definition of fascism is that it's what the other guy is doing, then you can't be fascist yourself, and there's no reason to worry about it, right? And I think Russia's, in a way, almost gotten itself to that point. But even more serious, I think, is the way that the Holocaust card has been played. I mean, if there's one event in the 20th century which we all ought to be very careful about how we talk about and hesitate before we bring it up for daily political use and consumption, it's that. And the clear attempt to point to exploit one of the West's virtues, which is the sensitivity to the Holocaust in Canada, the US, and much of Western Europe, is an example of the fascism tendency, which is, to me, the most disturbing one. Because if you trivialize the Holocaust by using it in everyday politics, then what do we have left? And in a way, that's one of the most dramatic examples of this trend of getting rid of authority. You use everything, and it has two consequences. The first consequence is you win the daily propaganda argument by bringing out the heavy artillery. But the second consequence is that you exhaust everyone's emotional and moral reserves. And so there's nothing, at the end of the day, there's nothing left on either side. And we're all in this kind of slippery, relativist, meaningless world where everything is about technique. On the basic issue, though, about whether it's domestic politics or not, I mean, I yield to your expertise here. I think that one thing, though, which is worth noticing, two things worth noticing. The first is I just don't think we should underestimate the sheer pleasure of, Primat der Außenpolitik, the sheer pleasure of making foreign policy when domestic policy is hard, the sheer pleasure of having victories. I mean, I don't know how you experienced this, but I mean, I was pretty close to it at the time. During those few days in Crimea, it was just clear that they were having fun. It was clear that they were enjoying themselves. And I think there was a certain pleasure involved in South Stream. I think there's a certain pleasure involved in seducing the German mass media. I think these operations bring with them a certain inherent pleasure. And in a state which is run by non-circulating elites, that's a factor which should be taken into account. The other thing about domestic politics is, I already stressed this, is that it's impossible to make a mistake. Where they've gotten themselves to now, it's impossible to make a mistake. You're not allowed to make mistakes. I mean, it's hard enough in a democratic country to admit that you made a mistake, right? But in the system they've gotten themselves into, it's very difficult to admit you've made a mistake. And I think it's pretty clear that a mistake was made. I mean, I think that what Russian foreign policy ought to have been was to pursue, just forget about Ukraine and pursue some kind of rapprochement with the European Union. If you want to marginalize the US, I mean, I'm now thinking like from the Kremlin's own position. If you want to marginalize the US, the way, and you want to fulfill your own economic interests, the way to go about it was a rapprochement with the European Union. And picking on Ukraine, which is strategically, irrelevant, picking on Ukraine and making that the center of the world's opinion was the way to sabotage what ought to have been Russian foreign policy. Now, no one obviously can say that, but that is a way that domestic public opinion catches in here. What I think where Russia's eventually going to get back to, whether in this regime or the next one, is some pro-Western policy, not overtly pro-American, probably overtly pro-European, but the tilt towards China is going to be felt to be threatening, I think, at some point. It's going to be seen as a downhill slide, which has no end, which it is. And they're going to be looking for a way to tilt back towards Europe. I think that's going to happen eventually. But the problem with public opinion is that you can't now You can't now do that. Public opinion in Russia, to put it a different way, functions only negatively. You have to maintain the high popularity, so you can't admit you made a mistake, which means you're actually constrained by your own previous choices in a way you wouldn't be in a democracy.
Public opinion in the West has something to do with that too. I think it's much harder to go back to business as usual with Russia today than it was, say, in 2008 after Georgia.
Yeah.
Okay, here. Wait for the mic.
I'm Peter Humphrey. I'm an Intel analyst. If Putin is okay with revanchist reunification of peoples, will he sign off when Kazakhstan wants to take a couple bites out of Xinjiang, when Hungary wants to take back 20% of Romania, when Finland reclaims Karelia, or when North Korea decides to take a little piece of the Russian Far East? Is this all okay with him?
Okay, so let me extend your question, because there are three different logics that Putin has mooted as reasons why the international system doesn't actually exist. The first is language. So the idea that it's actually language or ethnicity which defines political communities rather than boundaries. The second is history. So Novorossiya, for example, it's like this is the difference between Ruski Mir and Novorossiya. One is fundamentally about things that happened in the past. The other is fundamentally about languages and ethnicities. And the third has to do with just outright political will. So the first two, one takes your point, of course. If you took either of those seriously, language or history, then the entire world would have to change, and arbitrarily. Everything would be a mess, right? So let's say we turn the clock back to the 18th century or the 19th century. Okay, fine, but then, Portugal still has huge colonies in Africa, and so on and so on. That's one of the problems with this kind of reasoning. If you're going to make a historical argument about one part of the world, and you literally could turn the dial back to that year, let's say that the year of Russia's grandeur is 1815. Well, that's all very well, but then Britain gets back all of its colonies and so on. That's the basic. It's one basic way. It just doesn't make any sense. I'm getting to your question about what's okay with Putin, but I just want to stress that there are these deep logical problems with all this, and with language you have the same basic problems. People speak Russian in Donetsk, but people speak English in Kansas. Does that mean they should be part of England? It's obviously vacuous as a way of seeing the world, and if you took it seriously, it would have implications for which revolutionary is a hugely insufficient word. So, but the answer is clearly no. The answer is clearly no. Ukraine, everyone knows that Crimea used to belong to the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic, but few people know that a good deal of what's now Russia used to belong to the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. Few people know that boundary adjustments were made in various ways. Few people know that most Ukrainians, when they were drawing the map of Ukraine, included the Don, so a good deal of what's now southeastern Russia. These claims could be made in all kinds of ways if you want to make territorial adjustments. But the answer to your question is no. The answer is obviously that and this is what's characteristic, the entire world order is thrown into question so that you can have a tiny little bit of Ukrainian territory. That's what's so awful about all of it.
So why aren't we making that argument?
I don't know, I'm here to help.
And of course, Crimea was part of the Ottoman Empire before it was even part
Well,
of
the Crimea, I was at a dinner party with a lot of, with some really conservative American friends, and I was startled to hear around the table that of course, Crimea was always Russian, right? You hear things often enough and you start to believe them, but Crimea was not always Russian. Even when the Russian Empire finally made it to Crimea, they were perfectly aware it wasn't ethnic Russian. They were perfectly aware that it was Tatars and Ukrainians, who they called by another not very nice name at the time. But they were perfectly aware that what's now called Novorossiya was not in Crimea, was not actually inhabited by Russians. The Crimean Peninsula was inhabited by Greeks and by Tatars, and it's actually kind of a touchy question because it was also it was inhabited by a good number of Jews until the Holocaust took care of that, and it was inhabited by Crimean Tatars until Stalin ethnically cleansed them in 1943. And so the claim that Crimea was always Russian is wrong the way these always claims always are wrong. But also it covers over specific bits of history, which perhaps shouldn't be covered over. Don't call on anyone who's already asked a question.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Noor, and I'm a student studying international affairs at GW. My question is, do you think NATO should have been more assertive in responding to Russia?
When?
Sorry?
When?
When?
Mm-hmm.
Any time until now, I guess.
Okay.
Like when, yeah.
I mean, it's hard for it's hard for me to see NATO as a unit. And interestingly, like the folks here would know better than me, but I've been struck by how the High Command of NATO had been rather clear-sighted about all this, when sometimes American leadership wasn't. It depends what you mean. I mean, I don't think that I see no particular reason why Ukraine should be in NATO. Until very recently, there was very little support for that in Ukrainian society, which I think is rather important. I don't think that I don't think it was needed for, but the odd thing is you have majorities in favor of NATO now because Russia invaded the country, right? I mean, so it's one more way in which like this move wasn't, if Russia really were afraid of NATO, which I don't personally believe in, but if Russia were really afraid of NATO, why would you generate a situation in which your largest Western neighbor wants to join NATO? I think that I would pose the question a little bit differently. I think individual Western states needed to do a lot more after Crimea. I think Crimea needed to be seen, going back to our little conversation, as a much more categorical violation of an order. And that if that had happened, then we might not be where we are now.
Here.
No. You asked your question during the
My
presentation.
name is Alexis Savchenko.
When you ask your question during the presentation, you don't get to ask it afterwards. Sorry.
I would like to ask about the whole conflict in Ukraine and Eastern Ukraine for a long time was somewhere out in the boondocks for Europeans. The only event which directly had an impact on it was the Malaysian airplane. Now, if we compare the story with the previous Malaysian airplane, the coverage in the media, the Malaysian airplane which disappeared in the ocean, the coverage was much more extensive, was much more lengthy, although there were less events to cover. Something happened. Why this plane was forgotten? Nobody talks about it. Nobody talks about dozens of innocent people who died. And when I ask my Russian friends who are anti-Putin, strangely enough, they made the same explanation why Europe is, which onus is on Europe to investigate why it happened, why Europe is silent, kept silent. And the explanation which was given was exactly the same which you mentioned by Putin's followers, that Europe is weak, that Europe is not ready to face the music. What do you think? What were you saying? Why the plane was forgotten?
Why the plane was what?
Why the plane was forgotten? Why nobody talks about what happened to the plane?
Okay, all right, I got it, all right. So, there's a lot in what you say, of course, but I have to point out that, I mean, the coincidence of 2 Malaysian Airlines flights going down is just one of these weird things that happens in history. And the fact that the first of them wasn't discovered is what made it this news story. The fact that you could put cameras on the relatives for hours, or I guess it was days, until they had some idea what happened. That made it a dramatic news story. I mean, that has nothing to do with Ukraine or with the second jet. It's just the case that was an obsessive news story for purely formal literary reasons. So when something disappears, people obsess about it in general. I mean, that's how you do news stories. I mean, ideally, it's a blonde woman. If she disappears, you have a story forever in this culture. But an airplane will do as well. If an airplane disappears, you have a story until it's found. I don't agree that the second one was not covered or that was somehow insignificant. I mean, I saw this, I was in the German-speaking world when all this was taking place, and my read on that event is perhaps slightly darker than yours. My read on that event was that it was the moment when many Europeans in places like Germany especially came to see Ukraine as a place where real people might die. So long as it was just Ukrainians, or for that matter, Russians who were dying, those aren't real people. That's somewhere very far away. It doesn't really matter to us. But the moment when Dutch people and Germans and other Europeans, from the point of view of many everyday bourgeois Europeans, died, then it became a story. If you compare like Der Spiegel, which is the most widely read publication in Germany, you might remember that after the plight went down, that their cover of Der Spiegel were the faces of photographs of all of the victims, with the question, who will stop Putin? Which was totally different from the main line of their coverage up to that point. The Malaysian airline downing was the moment, I think, when European public opinion, especially in Central Europe, swung in a certain way. And sadly, it was because it was at that moment that it seemed like real lives were at stake. So the 2,500 or so people who had already died weren't counted as much as the 200 odd people who died on that flight. Again, just one of these accidents of history, but that's how it worked itself out. And of course, the Malaysian airline flight is also a very clear, it marks a line, it marks a kind of discursive line, because you say that no one talks about it. I mean, it was last Sunday that the Germany's intelligence service released its own report on what happened with the airline, which was that it was shot down by someone using anti-aircraft missiles from a certain spot. In other words, confirming essentially what was reported at the time. You didn't see that? Okay, I don't know what's news here and what's not, but it is actually a fairly big deal when the German intelligence service comes forward with a report like this, at least in Europe. And that what the report said was pretty much what you would expect it to say if you were reading Western newspapers at the time. So anyway, that airline flight is a kind of discursive border, because when you get far enough east, people think all kinds of things about what might have happened. But within Germany, what people think happened is pretty much what actually did happen.
Back here on the aisle.
Thank you very much. Khan with Hong Kong Phoenix TV. So, Professor, you mentioned that the Russians' actions in Ukraine is a terrible foreign policy because it pushes itself towards China. Could you elaborate on that a little bit further? And also, when talking about if this is going to be a new Cold War, there was a view that because there's no different ideology behind the two sides, so there won't be a Cold War, but today you seem to making a historical or ideological argument. So do you see this is going to be a Cold War, or where do you see this is going in the future? Thank you.
Thank you for those fantastically interesting questions. I would love to talk to you more about China, because I'm sure there are many things here which I could learn. When I say that it's a terrible foreign policy, I don't mean that because being close to China is in itself terrible. What I mean is that in general in foreign policy, you like to have options. And Russia was in, as I see things anyway, a favorable position insofar as it was between China and the European Union, right? Because then you can always tilt one way or the other. You can pretend to go one way, and then you can come back the other way. You can try to play one side against the other. When you're selling, when the way that you support your regime is selling fossil fuels, then you can play one side against the other. If you alienate one side and you only have the other, and both sides are stronger than you, you're in a much, at least economically, then you're in a much worse position. So that's why I see it as not such a sound foreign policy, because Russia, now is in a position where the Europeans are working, the Europeans have frozen South Stream, as you know. They're working very hard to have a comprehensive energy policy, which as the European Union, they could have. As individual nation states, they won't, which is one reason why Russian foreign policy aims towards the disintegration of the EU. But as the European Union, they very well could. They can make relatively small investments, and they could change things relatively quickly. And Russia has encouraged that with its foreign policy, and I think very likely will again this winter if it fools around with gas supplies, which I think is pretty likely. So when I say it's a terrible foreign policy, I mean it in like that very simple classical realist sort of way, that it's always better to be able to balance between two sides, and just giving up your ability to balance seems sort of just from a purely formal point of view, not very sound. Now China, again, there are people here from whom I could learn a lot, but China has been really interesting in this crisis. Too often China goes overlooked, and China is the winner here. Everyone has lost in this crisis to various degrees, I think, except China. Ukraine, in many ways, has lost. It's lost thousands of lives. It's in a terrible economic position. The European Union has lost a good deal of its credibility, of its internal cohesion. It's facing a basic challenge. The United States has lost in many ways as well. Russia, certainly, in the ways I tried to explain, is losing. It's losing economically, clearly, because of the sanctions. It's lost Ukraine, I mean, at least for a long, long, long time. It's succeeded in defining the Ukrainian political nation against itself in the only way which was possible, which is by way of a war. So, in a way, if I try to look at it from Beijing's point of view, and maybe you can correct me, but it seems to me that in a way, Russia, the EU, and America, despite all the differences, are kind of in this together. They're kind of sinking together. This has been, Russia's lost a lot, Ukraine's lost more, the Americans have lost something, but Europeans, but everyone is losing in this. Not China, because China has gained two things. The first is that, and has very cleverly not exploited these things and very cleverly not announced them, because Chinese foreign policy, unlike Russian policy, is about talking less than is necessary, right? As opposed to talking more than is necessary. Again, correct me if I'm wrong, but the two things that China has gotten out of this are, first, Russia is much less able, is a much weaker negotiating partner on the price of gas. And second, Ukraine is probably a more reliable supplier of agricultural goods, right? Now, so again, I don't know if these figures are accurate, but it's been reported in the American agricultural press that China has leased 9%, which is a big number, 9% of the fertile soil of Ukraine. As a hedge against future food shortages, right? Those contracts are much more enforceable if there's an association agreement between Ukraine and the European Union. Enforcing contracts in Ukraine is generally a very difficult business. So an outcome in which Russia is a weaker partner in negotiating gas deals and contracts are more enforceable in Ukraine is a very good outcome for China, because China is concerned about supplies of natural gas and it's concerned about food. So it seems to me that this has all worked out very well for the Chinese without them having to do very much about it.
I think you could actually add one other way in which this crisis has been beneficial to China, and that is it got somebody else to pose a fundamental challenge to the global order,
right,
to see what the response was going to be, and sort of file that away for future reference. Well, up here.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, wait for the mic.
Hi, Jordan Schneider, recent Yale history major. Talking about things that could potentially puncture or applied postmodernism. You seem to imply that Russian body bags could be one of them. Was wondering if there are sort of any others that could, crumble the edifice that are just too real for the Russian domestic population to ignore.
Yeah, look, it's a great question, and it would require, what the Germans call like the Fingerspitzengefühl for Russian domestic politics society. You'd have to have a really confident grasp of how you think Russian society works. I mentioned the terrible example of the Pskov battalion and Russian military dead because it was so obvious. It was so obvious in the Russian press, including the articles which were immediately pulled. It was obvious that the mothers of those soldiers did attract a good deal of attention. There was an inherent sadness to the way those corpses were treated, which Russians were alert to. And so that is the most obvious example of what you're calling reality. The end of life is a reality. It's not something you can pluralize away, on a talk show, at least not for most people. In fact, that's not quite true. You can at a distance. What happened to the Malaysian Airlines flight victims in a way is an example of how you can. It becomes not about them, it becomes about something else. But at the level of the mothers and the friends of the mothers and the people who care about the mothers, it can't be done. And I agree with you. How many more things like that there are? My fundamental view is that, and I could be wrong, but my fundamental view is that Russian society is much more like American society than either, the Russian leadership or the American leadership would like to admit. In other words, despite all the military talk and despite all of the feudal rhetoric and the food embargo. I think that the values inside Russian households are not so terribly different from the values inside American households, which would mean that the reason why you want sanctions is because sanctions create the possibility for a conversation inside the Russian middle classes and inside Russian elites. If the long-term consequence of sanctions is, as I believe it will be, that Russians are confronting different everyday realities having to do with very simple things like consumption patterns and vacations and universities and things like that, which so far they've been able to take for granted, I think you then are moving towards the pluralism, which I see as the antidote to this postmodern slipperiness, that you then have a kind of variety of conversation inside Russia, which you don't have now. So that's my very simple answer.
Okay. Oh, sorry, Kendra.
Ben Dossay here. I work for Dr. Brzezinski here at CSIS. Thank you for this fantastic presentation. I'm wondering if some of the, based on your reading of Putin as having sort of this postmodernist vision of the world, I'm wondering if then some of the analogies between Putin and Hitler or Putin and previous Russian leaders such as Stalin or Lenin are to some extent, they obscure the policy choices that Americans and European leaders should be making, in so much as Hitler and Stalin or Lenin had an arguably modernist view of how the world should be reordered, whereas if Putin has a postmodern view of the world where perhaps there is no ultimate destination, there is no one truth, then perhaps he should be dealt with in a different way. Obviously, his tactics are similar right now, and the effects are similar in so much as they pose a challenge to the world order, but I'm wondering if in the long run that we have to look at him in a different way. Thank you.
No, thank you for that question, which helps me to think through the implications of the analysis. I think you're right in that the way to handle this phenomenon is not to compare it to Stalin or Hitler. Not because I think that those sorts of things are totally illegitimate in and of themselves. I don't believe that there should be taboos on these things, but it can become. And some people who have made these kinds of comparisons I respect deeply, and especially inside the Russian political discussion where you pay a price for making these kinds of comparisons, like you lose your job. But that said, there's a way in which comparing it to Stalin and especially Hitler can be one of these forms of dismissing it. Right? Because if you say that it's about Hitler, at least in the American political discourse, you say, well, it's a little bit like Hitler, and then someone else says, but it's a lot not like Hitler, and then the discussion's over. And then suddenly, whether it's like Hitler has become the standard for whether we can have a foreign policy response. And that just can't be the standard, right, for whether we can have a foreign policy response. I think the way to think about Putin in history is this postmodern way, that as opposed to the slightly naive American and the also slightly naive European view, modern view of you learn lessons from the 20th century. You learn lessons from 1914, you learn lessons from 1938 or 39. You learn lessons and then you try to apply them. And you talk about how you're applying them. So you think about appeasement, or if you're a Frenchman in favor of European integration, you think about the Second World War. You learn these lessons. Like history accumulates, and hopefully knowledge accumulates, and you make better decisions. That's one way of looking at the past. Another way of looking at the past is there are people in the past who did incredibly clever things, and one could perhaps imitate them, right? So I think Putin appreciates 1938. I can't prove this, but I think he appreciates the way the European system was brought down in 1938. I think Sudetenland and Novorossiya are very much alike, and it's not an accident. I think it's not an accident that he's making the exact same arguments about Ukraine that were made about Czechoslovakia. I think it's not an accident that what he says about the so-called the ethnic Russians or whatever they might be, the compatriots, I think is the best word in English. The compatriots is exactly the same thing that Hitler said about the ethnic Germans in the Sudetenland. I think that's not accidental. I'm not sure, but I have a feeling it's not. I have a feeling that the way he deals with history, and he reads history, right? He reads history, just not quite like according to the syllabus that one would like, but he does read history, and he knows a lot of history. I mean, you see it in his speeches. He makes these little references, which people just completely ignore. He clearly knows history, but I think the way he's dealing with it is this postmodern fragmentary way. Here's a good example, here's a good example, I'm gonna follow this, as opposed to this kind of cumulative lesson learning way. So I agree with the gist of your question. I mean, I think we have to know history to understand Putin, but not because he's like A or B, but because he's reading history himself. And in a way, we're all in the same history with him. And if we have a different understanding of 1938, then we gotta be willing to enforce that different understanding.
All right, I've been informed that we're running low on time, so if you make it really quick, and this will be the last one.
Thank you for your talk, Dr. Snyder, and thank you for the history books you've read. My family is Ukrainian American. My name is Marika Ayagari, and my family has, some of them survived the history that you write about so eloquently. And I think it should be pointed out and expanded upon that Russia has spent hundreds of millions of dollars in propaganda since this whole fiasco began, and that Ukrainians are the victims of Putin and his violence and his aggression. Also, the Holodomor, the Soviet-created famine in eastern Ukraine, which killed approximately 5 to 10 million Ukrainians in eastern Ukraine, they were quickly replaced by loyal Russian Soviets by Stalin. That plays into this whole equation, so this didn't happen in a vacuum. My question is, how do you explain what I see as the outrageous anti-Ukrainianism in the US government when Poroshenko came here and was given only $53 million in assistance, when countries like Egypt and Pakistan are given $1 billion in military assistance annually?
Okay.
Thank you.
So, I mean, your references to the past, I would understand and recast in the following way. There are a lot of arguments in that part of the world that can be made from historical justice. I tend to think that as soon as anyone mentions historical justice in Ukraine, they probably should in the next breath mention the first 5-year plan and collectivization and starvation, because it is indeed the case that not 5 million, 10 million, I think is way overstated. I think it's around 3 to 3.5, but a huge number of people in the Ukrainian Republic of the Soviet Union were starved to death. And if one believes, if one claims to be a believer in historical justice, then that would be the kind of thing one would have to take into account. In other words, if one is going to talk about the historical justice of somehow Russian Empire, losing its claim to that same part of the world, one should also talk about the historical justice of millions of people dying. This is one of the reasons, this cascade of back and forth, that in general we don't talk about historical justice in this way. And in general, the consensus had been until recently that we're going to observe the borders that we inherited from the Soviet Union and from the Helsinki settlements and not change borders. Of course, what you say about the change in Ukraine is true. Of course, it's right that the Southeast especially would look demographically different if not for the famine. The whole society would look very different if not for the famine. This is all very true. For that matter, the Russian elite today would look very different if not for the terror of 1937 and 1938. All one can really do is encourage political change in these societies in such a way that new generations, as they grow up, have access to some kind of decent political life. And this is one of the things which for me is most touching and important about Ukraine, that you have a generation now which is between about 20 and 40, which is extremely impressive linguistically, academically, in its ambitions, in its contacts with the West. And that generation, I think, ought to have a chance to take part in decent political life and take power in that country, because the current elites still leave much to be desired. In other words, the only way to address these wounds ultimately is time. With American policy and why it hasn't been what one might have wished, I can only analyze that from a very great distance. I haven't been here. All I can say is that, and I hope I made this clear in the lecture itself, I think the stakes are very high. I think, you know, Ukraine is not one, it's not one little regional crisis like others. I think Ukraine is actually about, it's actually about things like whether we believe in truth, civil society, European integration, and the transatlantic relationship. I believe that, you know, I don't even believe it, it's just that it's just a basic fact. The Western order, which so much effort, time, blood, and treasure went into establishing after the Second World War and after 1989, has now been broken. And if we are serious about ourselves, then we have to be serious about trying to repair it, or ideally about articulating the new doctrine, which takes into account the new character of the challenges. And it's been a disappointment to me, of course, that this has not happened. Why it hasn't exactly happened, you know, that's beyond me. I've been far away, but that's what I think, as you can tell.
All right, great. Please join me again in thanking our speaker.